I want to begin by thanking the organizers for organizing it and for inviting me. It's a great honor. And I am so very sorry that I missed so very much of the workshop and spent so much time on trains yesterday. But I'm delighted, and now I get to the topic of my comments. I'm delighted that Huaping has undertaken such an in-depth study of Kant on race. And it is in fact the type of work that I hoped would be done when I wrote my 2007 paper, where I did some initial work, but also said much more needs to be done to find out just exactly how deep Kant's commitment to a racial hierarchy goes in the system as a whole, and what all the context is, and so on. And so, since 2007, much has changed. Not definitely as a result of my paper, but I mean in general, much has changed. And I think there are very few Kant scholars these days who believe they can quarantine Kant's views on race, and especially Kant's commitment to racial hierarchy, in one footnote. Right? So. A lot has changed, but this is still one of the first books, one of the first book-length treatments of the issue. So, I think that's great. And regarding Kant's views on race from the 1770s through the early 1790s, I find much that I find very interesting and that I agree with, and I enjoyed reading about the connection to Buffon and also the materials at the end about the canon and so on. So I'm not going to talk about all the things that I thought were great. I'm going to talk here about one of the main targets of Huaping's book, which is my thesis that Kant changed his views on racial hierarchy, slavery, and colonialism. And Huaping claims he did not. I claim he did. And so I'll focus on that issue just because I consider it a great honor. I mean, this kind of philosophy is, in that regard, a somewhat strange discipline. I consider it a great honor to be taken so seriously, that someone writes a whole book, and actually challenges the view to such a degree, and so that you are taken so seriously as to be one of the main targets of a book. But given that I'm the target, I am also grateful for the opportunity to respond. So that I will do. Huaping mentions 4 points of disagreement with me in the book. First, and they're on the handout, she argues that there's no contradiction between Kant's moral theory and his racial hierarchy. She claims, second, that I see Kant's condemnation of chattel slavery in the Metaphysics of Morals as the, quote, definitive evidence, that's Huaping's term, that he had second thoughts. So she thinks this is really the thing that I find most important. And she argues that Kant doesn't condemn chattel slavery in the Metaphysics of Morals. So, if this really were the most important thing to me and Kant doesn't, then that's bad news for my theory and for my interpretation. And third, she does concede that some of the passages in Kant's later works, that is from 1795 and later, could be read as criticisms of slavery and colonialism. But she claims that even if Kant perhaps regarded slavery and colonialism as morally wrong, he saw it as an inevitable phase in human history, and that he did so with, and this is a quote from Huaping and a term that she uses several times in the book, cold indifference to the atrocities suffered by human beings in concreto. So cold indifference is, so even if Kant did morally condemn it, he did so with cold indifference to enslaved persons and peoples oppressed in colonies. Furthermore, she claims that what Kant saw as the really disturbing aspect of colonial practices was their bad consequences for Europe itself, not their bad consequences for the enslaved and oppressed. And there are several passages where she makes that claim. She claims, quote, that Kant's remarks about racial slavery show no clear indication of concerns about the well-being, dignity, freedom of the enslaved and traded blacks, qua individuals. End quote. No concern. So that's the third item of disagreement. And then fourth, she uses some of Bernasconi's counter-arguments against my initial formulation of the thesis that Kant changed his mind. So those are four things that I found in the book that where she kind of disagrees. In my comments, what I'd like to do is first make a general observation and then provide initial replies to these 4 points, and then move and spend actually quite a bit of time on, spend time on some of the textual evidence from my earlier papers that I see as really the important evidence and that Huaping actually doesn't discuss. So, and I think they merit further discussion. So that's what I'll do. And the general observation that I'd like to start with is that in the whole book, and also in the paper on the topic, I actually didn't find a single passage from 1795 or later in which Kant actually endorses the racial hierarchy that he so often defended explicitly in his earlier years, and that Huaping claims he does remain committed to. But in Huaping's book, I didn't see any passage where Kant actually defends it in those later years. Nor did I find any passage from that period in which Kant endorses chattel slavery. Nor, third, did I find a single passage in which he endorses European colonialism from that later period, something which he positively advocated earlier. In other words, I saw no textual evidence in the book that directly shows that Kant remains committed to the earlier position on racial hierarchy, slavery, and colonialism. That is to say, I saw no textual evidence that directly refutes my second thought's interpretation. Or my question is, did I overlook something, which is possible because it's a large book. And I ask this because my thesis that Kant had second thoughts on the racial hierarchy in the mid-1790s is maximally vulnerable, right? It's a thesis that is really easily refuted if there is such evidence. But I didn't see any passages in which Kant clearly and unambiguously states what Huaping and Bernasconi and others say actually was his view in the second half of the 1790s. Most of their arguments are indirect. Also, in my earlier papers on the subject, that is the paper from 2007, Kant's Second Thoughts on Race, which, and the paper from 2014, Kant's Second Thoughts on Colonialism, I present much textual evidence for Kant's change of mind that Huaping doesn't discuss. And so I want to re-present it later on in my comments. But just let me just say what that's about here. So Kant's introduction of cosmopolitan right in Toward Perpetual Peace and in the Metaphysics of Morals, she doesn't discuss. And this is Kant's innovative introduction of a new juridical status for all that he explicitly grants to humans on all continents, and he specifically mentions peoples on all continents. It's not just a European thing. And it is a juridical status that he says rules out imperialist colonialism, rules out enslavement. And I will show you some of the quotes that I base this on, and maybe you say I'm mistaken, but then we have that discussion. Second, Kant has a novel emphasis on the importance of contracts made with the free and informed consent of the local population before settlements by foreign individuals, corporations, or countries, states, is permitted. He explicitly extends the scope of this normative requirement to all continents, and he actually criticizes the Europeans for making fraudulent contracts, for conquering and establishing colonies that way. And he says if there is going to be colonial settlements, that can only happen with the explicit, free and voluntary consent of the population. So that's, and then third, I talk, and I won't actually come back to this here, but I do talk in the earlier papers about the role of, the changing role of race in Kant's philosophy of history, and the fact that Kant actually took out references to race from his account of historical progress, starting with perpetual peace. And then fourth, I present evidence from Kant's descriptions of other so-called races that change. For example, his attribution of military courage to Native Americans on a par with that of medieval European knights in toward perpetual peace. That's a very different kind of thing to ascribe to Native Americans, who Kant thought earlier were totally weak and inert and incapable of anything. Right? So there are concrete changes in the characteristics that Kant ascribes to non-European peoples. So in my view, those pieces of evidence need merit discussion. And I would think that they constitute a problem for the continuity thesis that Huaping defends. So of course, I'm not saying that Huaping doesn't present much evidence. For her reading, she does. And so let me address those 4 points on which she expresses disagreement, the ones I mentioned at the beginning, and they're listed on your handout. And so they're the 4 points on which she rests her case against my interpretation. So I just wanted to reply to those challenges. And the first one concerns the issue of whether there's a contradiction in Kant's work. And Huaping rightly points out, and I agree with her on that when Kant speaks of humankind making progress, this doesn't necessarily mean that all individuals and all subsets of humans, and that includes racial subsets, as Kant conceives of them, contribute to or share in that progress. It's a point that I have myself made against Bert Loudon. Huaping also makes it against Bert Loudon. I think that's a good point. But it's not how I reconstruct the contradiction. And the contradiction that I reconstruct is a contradiction between Kant's claim, on the one hand, that all humans are persons and ought never to be used merely as means, and, on the other hand, his approval of enslavement of humans based on their race, so-called race, even though all humans and all human races are, per definition, humans, right? They're human races. So it's not a contradiction between an abstract principle applied to humankind at large, but not to all humans, on the one hand, and the concrete application at the individual level at the other. The contradiction I see emerges at the level of concrete application. Kant says in the groundwork that you ought never use another human being merely as a means. Right, that's something he says. You ought never use other human beings merely as a means. He gives an example of a concrete case, an applied case. If you make a false promise to repay a loan, just so that you get money easily, you're using the lender merely as a means. So we're at the level of concrete application here. So Kant says you ought never to do that. Human individuals of all races are human beings, per definition, and nevertheless Kant approves of using many human individuals of some so-called races merely as means, namely as slaves, in the period up to 1795. I think that's contradictory. And it is a contradiction that is happening at the same level of application. So it doesn't have the structure of the one that Huaping discusses and the one where I think she's right. I think it's a different kind of contradiction and one that is more straight, one that I don't think Huaping addresses this contradiction. Now to the second point, the evidence about chattel slavery in the metaphysics of morals. So I do think Kant condemns chattel slavery in the metaphysics of morals. Huaping thinks he does not. But I would first like to start off by saying that's not my main evidence. She presents it as what I see as the definitive evidence, but I myself don't think it is. My thesis is based on a much larger body of textual evidence, and I indicated as much at the beginning, and I will come back to that below. But here, let me just say something about that passage in the Metaphysics of Morals, which concerns a footnote of mine. So she challenged a footnote of mine against Bernasconi about a particular passage. And in that passage, Kant claims that an employment contract is illegitimate if the degree of use of the employee is left at the discretion of the employer, since that would permit employers to work their employees to death or despair, meaning that it would be de facto a contract of servitude, which is wrong in terms of Kant's doctrine of right. Right? So the issue, what's at issue is that there should be in employment contracts a clause that stipulates a particular degree to which employees can be have to make efforts. Now, in that discussion, Kant introduces slavery on the so-called Sugar Islands, which is, of course, a totally European European way of referring to the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands, as an example in which persons are worked to death. I think that that argument entails that he condemns chattel slavery, and Huaping argues that it doesn't. I think it does because you don't illustrate your argument that something is wrong by with an example of something that you think is right. So I think the fact that he uses the horrendous practices of enslavement on those islands as an example indicates that that's the kind that he wants to rule out. But more importantly, even if Kant did not, so this is the conditional, even if Kant did not condemn chattel slavery in this passage, that wouldn't show that he still endorses it. It would just mean that the passage doesn't provide evidence for either of us, neither for Huaping nor for me. It's just like, at most it would be multi-interpretable, right? But it doesn't provide clear evidence one way if we grant to Huaping that this example might be read differently. But I don't think it should be read differently. I think it is a criticism of slavery, but I just want to say it certainly doesn't show that he endorses it. Third, Huaping points to passages where Kant not only condemns colonialism on moral grounds, but also highlights the bad consequences of colonialism for Europe itself. And he does, right? We know the passages. The colonies don't yield any great profit anymore, but they do lead to war in Europe. That's bad, Kant says, and he did highlight those bad effects in addition to condemning colonialism on moral grounds. And what Huaping takes away from Kant's pragmatic comments was that he was mostly interested in colonialism's bad effects on Europe rather than in its effects on those who suffered from it. And I would like to dispute that. So I think what Huaping does with the text here is what she herself would call an unduly individualistic interpretation of Kant's statements. These kinds of pragmatic arguments were an abolitionist and anti-colonial trope at the time. People used this as an argument against colonialism. They were very common in the literature against colonialism and slavery. Authors included such pragmatic arguments, hoping that they might convince those who are unmoved by the moral condemnation. So there's no reason to think that the appeal to pragmatic considerations shows that he still defends a racial hierarchy, or slavery, or colonialism. Consider a more recent case for comparison. If someone criticizes the oppression of women and says it would be good for the economy if the labor market were more accessible to women, right? That's an argument we all know from feminist literature and other kinds of literature saying, you know, it would be good to open up the labor market for women. It would be good for the economy. The oppression of women is bad for the economy. If someone says that, that doesn't mean that they see women as inferior to men. Similarly, if Kant criticizes the behavior of European colonial states not only on the grounds of injustice, but also with economic or other pragmatic arguments, that doesn't provide any evidence that he still saw non-Europeans as inferior. In fact, Kant's comment is literally sandwiched between two blistering condemnations of the injustice perpetrated by the European states. And I'll show that later on with the texts. So, number 4, Bernasconi. So, Huaping uses a number of arguments that Bernasconi also uses, and she says, you know, they're very strong, and Kleingeld makes no attempt to address these in any of her subsequent works. But I have addressed them at great length. Well, I mean, for countering someone's arguments, I think more than 5 pages of sustained argumentation is kind of addressing them in the paper on colonialism, second thoughts on colonialism. I, in fact, take on Bernasconi's claims and reply. For example, on the issue of Kant's republication history, the fact that he republished some of the race papers late in life, I respond to that. Bernasconi, I think, was also the person who first came up with this point about Kant's reference to Geertanner, Christoph Geertanner, in the published version of the Anthropology. So Kant published his Anthropology lectures in 1798, and in all his lectures he has a section on the characteristics of race, in which he used to develop his racial hierarchy, with the whites on top and Native Americans on the bottom, with the various so-called races having all kinds of deficits compared to the so-called whites. However, in the published version of the Anthropology, which is from 98, which is from, you know, the second half of the 1790s, and we don't have anthropology lectures from those few years because Kant stopped lecturing at that time. In the published version, he took it out. He took out the hierarchy. And in fact says, well, you know, if you want to read about race, look at Christoph Geertanner's book, which follows my principles. I think this is indication that Kant no longer defended the hierarchy. And in fact, in the introduction to the Anthropology, Kant explicitly says racial differences have no pragmatic relevance. Whereas in the earlier lectures, he talked about the racial hierarchy, especially because he said it had pragmatic relevance. And surely it did. It meant whites could use other persons. Actually, I think that I hesitate to say non-whites because it is kind of a bad way of referring to the other races, right? But this is exactly how Kant thought about it in the earlier period. So I will on occasion talk about non-whites or non-Europeans, just because that is a proper way of describing Kant's talk about, you know, how Kant saw it. So in the earlier lectures, Kant did present the hierarchy because he did think it had pragmatic relevance, because the whites could use the non-whites as slaves or colonize their territories and so on. So the fact that he changes that in the preface and says out loud, like, people, it has no pragmatic relevance, to me indicates a change of mind. So what then about Geertanner? Well, I read Geertanner, and Geertanner does not defend a racial hierarchy of his own. He mostly is interested in race as a physiological concept, so as a biological theory that answers biological questions about heredity and tries to respond to puzzles like why is it that, you know, if a blue-eyed and a brown-eyed human procreate, the kid has either blue eyes or brown eyes, whereas if white-skinned and black-skinned parents procreate, the skin color is somewhere in between. Pre-Mendel, those were things that, you know, were puzzles, and Kant's theory of race is partly developed to deal with that, and that's what Geerthaner also focuses on to a large extent. And we find signs of racial hierarchy in the book only in Kant quotes, as far as I could see. And so when Huaping writes that Geerthaner made denigrating claims about blacks and Native Americans, and therefore that Kant's reference to Geerthaner's book means he still endorsed the hierarchy, I don't think it's right, because the two passages she cites, so she refers to 2 pages, and those are the Kant quotes, not Geerthaner's own words. So I don't know, and maybe Huaping knows, whether Kant even knew that these embarrassing, appalling, terrible quotes from his earlier period were in there. I don't know, and I haven't researched it. But in short, from the mere fact that Kant recommends Geerthaner's book, we cannot infer that Kant still defended the racial hierarchy in 1798. So as far as these 4 points of disagreement goes, I'm not convinced to give up my second thoughts thesis. And I'd like to go to some textual evidence, but before I do that, I'd like to make one textual comment that's not actually about Huaping's book, but about a point that I'm encountered with often. And people tell me that for my second thoughts thesis really to be convincing, I should be able to point to a passage in which Kant explicitly repudiates his earlier views. Now, I totally agree. It would have been much better if Kant had repudiated his earlier views out loud with a big flag and distanced himself from those views, and for many reasons. But I don't think that we should use that kind of explicit meta-statement as a hermeneutical requirement. So the standard would be, the requirement would be that if an author first defends view X and later changes to view Y, we would need a third separate statement, people have changed from X to Y, before we can actually be justified in saying that the author changed their view. This is not a standard we ordinarily use. We do not normally require a meta-statement over and above the philosopher's statements of the new view as compared to the old view. Take Kant's introduction of the theory of autonomy in the groundwork. We compare it to his moral theory of the first critique, and there was a moral theory in the first critique, and we conclude that he changed his views in important regards. Normally, when we look at the available textual evidence, and if we see a particular pattern that indicates that Kant changed his position, we say he changed his position. Even when Kant didn't say that he did. In fact, there are many cases where Kant changed his position and he didn't say that he did. And there people don't use this higher standard as required before we can say that he changed his view. So I see no reason to use a higher standard in the case of Kant on race. So I think we should just look at the text, look at what he says in the earlier papers, see if he still says that in the later papers, and if he does not, we can say he changed his view. If there's a pattern, right? I mean, you need a little more than just one passage, but I just wanted to say this, but not because of anything Huaping said in her book, but because it's something that I encounter. People tell me that I need to show that Kant had this meta-statement, and then he doesn't. So let us go to some of the passages that I see as strong evidence for a change of mind on Kant's part, and that I've also quoted in earlier work, and that I think merit a bit more discussion, perhaps, than Huaping gave them. But because, of course, I am claiming that there's a before and after with a change in the middle, I also want to start with some of the earlier stuff, so we can actually really compare the before with the after. Okay, so I have a bunch of quotes on your handout also. In the 1770s and 1780s, Kant defended colonialism. To give just one example, in the Deunhoff lectures on physical geography from 1782, he explained that India would be happier under a stronger form of European colonial rule. These peoples, namely in India, deserve a better fate than their current one because it is a very manageable and easily governed people. This much is certain, that if they were to be ruled by a European sovereign, the nation would become happier. Right? That seems to me a clear endorsement of European colonial rule in the case of India. The comment clearly indicates not just Kant's endorsement, but even his active recommendation of European colonial rule. India deserves it because it's so easily governed, and it will be happier as a result. Now, Kant's defense of colonialism rests on, and this is important, I think, rests on the alleged racial hierarchy among the four so-called races. Right? So the defense of colonialism is clearly and intricately linked with the defense of the racial hierarchy, with the whites on top. The three so-called other races allegedly have various deficits that make it impossible for them to govern themselves politically. So deficits in terms of capacities for thought and action. None except the whites can govern themselves politically, and that's why they have to take charge of the world. That's sort of roughly Kant's idea. Kant characterizes the different so-called races in terms of politically relevant competences, or lack thereof. Consider the following passages. And these are all things that you find in various anthropology lectures, not just in one place, but they are repeated. Quote, Americans and blacks cannot govern themselves. Thus they serve only as slaves, end quote. Blacks are said to, quote, adopt the culture of bondsmen, but not of freemen, and they are incapable of leading themselves, end quote. Hindus are said to be superior to blacks because they can be educated, but they can be educated only in the arts, not in the sciences and other endeavors that require the use of abstract concepts. They are hence incapable of being magistrates, and hence incapable of genuine freedom and virtue. The so-called white race is superior and the only non-deficient race, and this is a quote you no doubt know. The race of whites contains all the incentives and talents. Now, this is a racial hierarchy we find in many of the anthropology lectures. And accordingly, in this period, Kant comments on the types of slaves one needs, right? That's from the European perspective. One needs for various types of labor, one being the slave-owning European. And he remarks that blacks, quote, seem to be made to serve others, end quote, and were created for the harsh labor conditions on the so-called sugar islands. So Kant makes this link between, you know, lacking capacities for self-government, and then, you know, what's nature's purpose in having these other races, right? Well, they must be somehow useful to Europeans. That's what he literally suggests, right? They can't govern themselves, thus serve as slaves. Now, here's another passage from the Deunhoff lectures on physical geography. This is something I also quoted in the colonialism paper, and I find it hard to read, but I do it because we have to know what we're dealing with here. So I hope, yeah. The Mandinka are the very most desirable among all blacks up to the Gambia River because they are the most hardworking ones. These are the ones that one prefers to seek for slaves because they can tolerate labor in the greatest heat that no human being can endure. Each year, 20,000 of this black nation have to be bought to replace the decline of them in America, where they are used to work on the spice trees and in general on the entire établissement. One gets the Negroes, the blacks, by having them catch each other and one has to seize them with force, end quote. Note again Kant's adoption of the perspective of the slave owners in explaining to his students, right? Yeah, he is talking to these 18-year-olds here about which kinds of slaves one prefers and which have to be bought, and how many of them. Very clearly, Kant displays what Huaping calls cold indifference. On this point, I could not agree with her more. I think that's the only thing you can say about this. It's cold indifference. Note again Kant's adoption of the perspective of the, oh, I already said that. So we still find this cold indifference in Kant's 1792 Dona lecture. So I'm always looking for like how far does that racial hierarchy extend in Kant's work? Where do we still see it? And I still see it in 1792. There are even some passages in 1793 that seem consistent with it. But here is a passage on the so-called sugar islands. And I will use that for comparison because Kant also talks about the so-called sugar islands in Perpetual Peace. So here is a description. Much more important than Cuba is Santo Domingo. On the French part of this island alone, there are 350,000 blacks. On Jamaica, 200,000. On Martinique, Guadeloupe, the Grenadines, the number of blacks varies very much. It is the proper standard of wealth. The old Indian inhabitants, Caribs now living only on Saint Vincent, can tolerate this kind of labor as little as the Europeans. Only blacks were created for it. Puerto Rico is not cultivated much, as the Spanish run things everywhere. As long as the soil stays rich, this will be all right, but as soon as it needs fertilizer, the yield will diminish greatly. For only the old fertile soil, black earth, produces the greatest profit from this island. End quote. So again, Kant educates his students on the use of these territories for European profit, and as on earlier occasions, he depicts the indigenous peoples of the Americans as physically weak. Blacks, on the other hand, are said to have been created for the harsh labor conditions on the sugar plantations. So again, cold indifference. If, you know, there's no other word for Kant's attitude as he describes just how many one has to buy, right? And even though he knows exactly what's going on these islands, people are dying by the tens of thousands per year, and that's why you have to replenish them. He knows exactly what's going on, and he just explains how to make profit. But, okay, so now we get to 1795. And let's compare these descriptions, the quote about the Mandinka and the quote about the Sugar Islands, with Kant's description of the very same islands in Toward Perpetual Peace. Instead of presenting information regarding the kinds of slaves one needs and the ones most useful for labor in these colonies and which type of soil yields the greatest profit, Kant now condemns the European conduct on these islands as reprehensible violence and cruelty. So here we go. If one compares with this, that is with the principle of cosmopolitan right, so Kant, this quote is from Kant's explanation and discussion of the notion of cosmopolitan right, this juridical status that each human person has. If one compares with this principle, the inhospitable behavior of civilized, especially commercial states in our part of the world, Europe, the injustice they show in visiting foreign land and peoples, which with them is tantamount to conquering them, goes to horrifying lengths. When America, the Black countries, the Spice Islands, the Cape and so forth were discovered, they were to them countries belonging to no one, since they counted the inhabitants as nothing. In the East Indies, Hindustan, they brought in foreign soldiers under the pretext of merely proposing to set up trading posts, but with them the oppression of the inhabitants, incitement of the various Indian states to widespread wars, famine, rebellions, treachery, and the whole litany of troubles or ills or evils that oppress the human race. End quote. I don't think we can call this cold indifference. Here we find Kant speaking of horrifying injustice, oppression of the local population, and instead of explaining how many slaves one needs each year, he now criticizes the European states for counting the original inhabitants of the colonies as nothing. He criticizes them for that. He goes on to call the Sugar Islands a place of the, quote, most gruesome and most calculated slavery, allergrausamste sklaverij. Again, none of these descriptions suggest cold indifference, and they're entirely different in tone and tenor from his earlier description of the treatment of the Mandinka. What I also find interesting is to see that he changes the perspective. He's no longer talking about one needs this, that, or the other thing, but he's talking about them, the European states. He distances himself from their conduct in his descriptions. Kant continues his criticism of the horrifying violence perpetrated by the Europeans in general, and on the Sugar Islands in particular, by saying the following. The worst of this, or considered from the standpoint of a moral judge, the best, is that they, the European states, don't even profit from this violence. So this is the quote that I referred to earlier that Huaping mentions. They don't even profit from this violence. All these trading companies are on the verge of collapse. That the Sugar Islands, that place of the most gruesome and most calculated slavery, yield no true profit, but serve only immediate and indeed not very laudable purpose, namely training sailors for warships, and so in turn carrying on wars in Europe. And this for powers that make much ado of their piety, and while they drink injustice like water, want to be known as the elect in orthodoxy. Now, Huaping quotes the first half of this sentence as evidence for her thesis that Kant displays cold indifference to the enslaved and is focused only on inter-European effects of colonialism. I already mentioned that that was a trope at the time, a commonplace. But note that she omits the rest of the sentence, where Kant criticizes the Europeans for drinking injustice like water, right? That's not cold indifference in my mind. So, to say that Kant shows cold indifference, I think, is to read somewhat selectively. Kant's remarks about the bad effects of Europe for Europe, it's not only a trope, an anti-colonial trope at that, but it's also sandwiched between two blistering condemnations. And I use this as a term that is to be a contrast to cold indifference, right? It's blistering is hot. So it's blistering condemnations instead of cold indifference. First, the condemnation of the horrifying injustice and oppression that is bad for humans everywhere on the planet, right? Kant doesn't refer to Europeans only. These things oppress the human race as a whole. And second, the condemnation of the European states as drinking injustice like water under a very hypocritical religious guise, right? They pose as, spreading the gospel or something, and in fact, they're drinking injustice like water. So I'm not swayed yet that Kant remained cold and indifferent to the atrocities perpetrated towards people on other continents than Europe by the Europeans. So I think if you compare the quotes from the 1780s and the early 90s with the quotations from Toward Perpetual Peace from 1795, it seems clear to me that Kant has changed his mind. And I would like to know, in light of these kinds of quotes, and there are many, many more, I just have limited time, that shows that Kant has changed his mind profoundly. Now, these quotations from Perpetual Peace are taken from his discussion of cosmopolitan right, and that, as I said, is a new category that Kant introduces around the very same time when he begins to criticize colonialism and slavery. Cosmopolitan right grants full juridical status to all humans. It covers relations between states and foreign individuals and groups, including non-state peoples. Among other things, cosmopolitan right prohibits colonial imperialism of precisely the type that he used to defend. He writes that no one has a right to settle land used by others except when expressly permitted through a treaty, And he adds explicitly that treaties ought not to be concluded by fraudulent means, and he says that's exactly what the Europeans did and do. Kant calls the trade in blacks a grave violation of cosmopolitan right, and he strongly, and that was a quote, and he strongly condemns the founding of colonies by annexation, explicitly mentioning the territories of the, quote, American Indians, the so-called, well, so-called's my interpolation, Hottentots, Khoikhoi, and the inhabitants of New Holland as examples. So he gives concrete examples of what he thinks is totally wrong. So when he condemns colonialism, he's not just talking about the Irish. In an important draft for Toward Perpetual Peace, he also claims that, and this is again a quotation, the principles underlying the supposed lawfulness of appropriating newly discovered and purportedly barbaric or irreligious lands as good belonging to no one, without the consent of the inhabitants and even subjugating them as well, are absolutely contrary to cosmopolitan right. This is Kant speaking. Now, cosmopolitan right, or cosmopolitan law, depending on your translation, is conspicuously absent in Huaping's book. I didn't find a discussion of it, but I do think it's relevant to the issue of whether Kant changed his mind on racial hierarchy. After all, as I said, there is a clear link between racial hierarchy and colonialism and slavery. Remember that Kant characterized the races, in part by reference to their ability or inability to govern themselves, and that he justified European colonialism on this basis, on the basis that the other races couldn't do it. Native Americans can't govern themselves, so they serve as slaves, right? That was one of the quotes I gave. East Asians cannot think abstractly enough to be magistrates, so the Europeans need to rule them. That's how the argument used to go. And that means that if Kant now criticizes colonialism in 1795 and later, we can turn this argument around. For if their inability to govern themselves justified European colonialism, the fact that Kant later sees colonialism as unjustified and sees people on other continents capable of self-government, that's what it means. Indeed, he talks about there being a republic in India later, in the later, some of the later texts. He must have had second thoughts about racial hierarchy, right? It goes together. And indeed, instead of his earlier claims that Africans and Native Americans cannot govern themselves and that Europe rightly legislates for them, Kant now envisions a world in which peoples on different continents establish peaceful relations with one another. He sketches a vision of a world in which, quote, distant parts of the world can enter peaceably into relations with one another, which can ultimately become publicly lawful and so bring the human race ever closer to a cosmopolitan constitution, end quote. He expresses the hope that all the states of the world will form a union for lawful settlement of their disputes, and he writes that this state of peoples, Völkerstaat, would finally encompass, this is a quote, finally encompass all the peoples of the earth, end quote. All peoples of the earth, not just Europe, all peoples of the earth are to strive towards a union of states that will settle their conflicts at a federal level. Compared to his earlier vision of global European colonialism, this is a pervasive change of view. So I think there is good textual evidence that Kant changed his mind. If we do compare the early stuff and the late stuff, we do see he changed his mind. At least that's how it seems to me. And I think that before we accuse someone of endorsing a racial hierarchy, someone who also writes the things that I quoted from the 1795 and 1797 texts, before we accuse someone who wrote those things of endorsing a racial hierarchy, slavery and colonialism, we need to really have good textual support. So I still defend my thesis. Thank you for your attention.